Very few starships in Star Trek history have inspired as much discussion despite never appearing on screen as the NX Refit. For over 2 decades, fans of Star Trek Enterprise have wondered what might have happened had the series continued beyond its 4th season. We know the show is building towards some of the most important events in Federation history: the Earth-Romulan War, the coalition of planets, and ultimately, the founding of the United Federation of Planets itself. But alongside those major historical events, another question has fascinated fans for years: what would have happened to the NX Enterprise? Subscribe to never miss another Star Trek video. While we're talking about Star Trek starships, now is a great time to tell you about our partner website, the Cargo Bay. If you're looking for Star Trek action figures, mouse mats, or even Klingon keyboards for your PC, this is the place to go. The Cargo Bay has an exciting range of sci-fi collectibles, including these new spaceport mugs, which come in a range of colours, ready to ship right away. Head over to the link in the video description and make it so. Okay, let's talk about the NX Refit class. By the end of Season 4, Captain Jonathan Archer's ship had already spent years exploring deep space, fighting with Xindi, confronting the Suliban Cabal, surviving encounters with the elusive Romulans, and helping lay the foundations of what would eventually become the Federation. The NX had changed the course of history, but the ship itself was still very much a product of its own era. Compared to later Starfleet vessels, it lacked many technologies that would eventually become standard. It had no shields, relying instead on polarized hull plating. It lacked tractor beams and instead used grapplers, which is super cool. Its warp systems were comparatively primitive, and its weapons were rather basic, ill-suited to a much more dangerous and uncertain frontier. The ship that had launched humanity into the stars was revolutionary, but it was already beginning to show its age. And that's where the NX Refit comes into the picture. Designed by Enterprise production artist Doug Drexler, the NX Refit represents a glimpse into the future of what the NX class might have looked like. It bridges the gap between Archer's NX Enterprise and Kirk's original USS Enterprise. This shows the missing evolutionary step between humanity's first great explorer and the iconic Constitution class that would follow almost a century later. Today we're exploring the history, technology, lore, and real-world development of the NX Refit, often considered one of the most famous Star Trek ships that barely appears on our screens. Now by the end of this video, you might just agree with the many fans who believe this is the Enterprise that should have been. Why not consider supporting us on Patreon to keep these videos coming? The link's down below. You also get an exclusive Trek Central pin. To understand the NX Refit, we first need to understand the ship it was built from. This is the NX class. The design represented a turning point in human history. Prior to the launch of the Enterprise NX-01 in 2151, humanity had explored only a relatively small region of space. Warp travel existed, but ships lacked the speed, endurance, and technological sophistication needed for true deep space exploration. Everything changed with the Warp 5 program. Led by Henry Archer and his engineering team, the program aimed to create a propulsion system capable of reaching Warp 5, allowing humanity to explore farther and faster than ever before. The result was the NX class. At approximately 225 meters in length, the NX class was one of the most advanced vessels Earth had ever constructed. The design combined lessons learned from earlier warp vessels with technologies developed in cooperation with Vulcan advisors. Now the NX class featured Starfleet's new Warp 5 engine, polarized hull plating, spatial torpedoes, phase cannons, shuttle pods, and grappler systems. But most importantly, it represented humanity's first true explorer out into the final frontier. For 4 years, under the command of Captain Jonathan Archer, Enterprise NX-01 pushed deeper into unknown space than any Earth vessel before it. But exploration came at a cost, because every new encounter revealed weaknesses Starfleet hadn't anticipated. One of the most fascinating aspects of Star Trek Enterprise as a series is watching humanity learn in real time. Unlike later Starfleet crews, Captain Archer and his officers frequently found themselves unprepared for the dangers they encountered. They learned about shields because they needed shields, they learned about tactical doctrine because they kept getting shot at, and they learned about Starship design by discovering what did and didn't work. Throughout the series, the NX-01 underwent numerous upgrades, phase cannons were improved, hull plating was reinforced, photonic torpedoes replaced older weapon systems. New sensors and tactical systems were also installed on board. The ship was constantly evolving the more that was learnt. And nowhere was this more evident than during the Xindi conflict. The Delphic Expanse nearly destroyed Enterprise on more than one occasion. The vessel survived from many of the engagements in the Delphic Expanse, heavily damaged and barely operational. Those experiences fundamentally changed Starfleet's understanding of what future starships would require. According to Doug Drexler, the NX class was always intended to evolve. The ship was never supposed to remain static. Instead, the NX represented the beginning of a design lineage that would eventually lead directly to the Constitution class, which immediately evokes comparisons to the Constitution class Enterprise. This would include better class performance, a much more advanced primary warp core, improved protection compared to early defensive methods. The NX Refit would have been Enterprise in line with technologies that would later become standard through Starfleet. When Star Trek Enterprise was cancelled in 2005, fans lost far more than just another 3 seasons of television. The series had finally found its footing when it ended. For example, Season 4 of Enterprise is widely regarded as one of the strongest seasons of Star Trek ever produced, introducing multi-episode story arcs, exploring long-standing mysteries, and laying the groundwork for the events that would eventually lead to the Federation. Most importantly, Enterprise was beginning to move into territory that Star Trek fans had wanted to see for decades. For example, the Earth-Romulan War was being teased, the coalition of planets was being set up, and the birth of the Federation itself edged closer and closer. Had Enterprise continued, the NX Refit would likely have found itself at the centre of all 3 of those events, plus many more. While we're going over the NX Refit, let's discuss the technical information. Visually, the NX class and its refit configuration, later known as the Columbia class, are very similar to each other, but there are noticeable differences that are quite obvious. Of course, the most obvious one is the addition of a secondary hull, along with a larger deflector dish protruding from the front of the drive section. It's here where similarities between the future Constitution class are actually drawn. We'll go over this, along with other details of the NX Refit as this video goes on. Now, this new drive section was connected via a small neck. It was positioned where the NX class's shuttle pod doors had been located. These bays, in the Refit class, had been moved to either side of the new neck structure. The warp field governor was also moved to the dorsal hull of the drive section. The actual size of the NX-01, following its refit, and this would apply to all NX Refit and Columbia class ships, is still not fully confirmed. It is generally assumed and accepted that the length of 225 meters stayed the same. A width of 135.8 meters is given, however, no height is given at the moment. For Star Trek fans, the Earth-Romulan War has always occupied a fascinating place in the franchise's history. First mentioned all the way back in the original series episode, Balance of Terror, the conflict was described as one of the most devastating wars in human history. It reshaped the political landscape of the Alpha Quadrant. It established the neutral zone that appears in Star Trek The Next Generation. And it permanently defined relations between the Federation and the Romulan Star Empire. Yet despite its importance, the war has never been fully depicted on screen. Enterprise appeared perfectly positioned to tell that story. Season 4 had already introduced the Romulans as a growing threat operating from the shadows. Their attempts to destabilize relations between Earth, Vulcan, Andor, and Tellar Prime hinted at a much larger conflict waiting to unfold. According to Doug Drexler, the NX Refit was specifically envisioned as the Enterprise's wartime upgrade. The original NX class had served admirably as an explorer, but a warship was now needed. The lessons learned from the years of exploration and conflict would finally be incorporated into a more powerful, more capable vessel designed to survive a major interstellar war. Named after the NX-02 Columbia, the NX Refit class became one of the earliest major Starship programs of the newly formed Federation in 2161. Though it should be worth noting, the NX Refit does predate the formation of the Federation. Historically, successful prototype designs often serve as a foundation for future fleets. The NX Refit effectively demonstrated what the next generation of Earth and Federation starships could actually look like. As a result, Starfleet began moving towards full-scale production. The Columbia class retained the general configuration introduced by the refit while further refining the design. The result was a vessel that looked unmistakably like a bridge between the NX class and the Constitution class. For many fans, and many Trekkies, this remains one of the most satisfying pieces of Star Trek ship evolution ever created. Now, one particularly fascinating aspect of the expanded lore involves Jonathan Archer himself. By the 2160s, Archer had become one of Starfleet's most influential figures. No longer simply the captain of Enterprise, he was now helping shape the future of the entire Federation fleet as an admiral. According to the novels, Archer strongly supported a large-scale modernization program based around the Columbia-class design. His reasoning was simple. The Federation needed ships capable of defending its growing territory while continuing its mission of exploration. The Columbia-class offered both. It represented the perfect balance between the rugged practicality of the NX class and the sophistication of later Federation vessels. Several new ships were eventually constructed as part of this initiative, helping to lay the foundation for the eventual Federation Starfleet. While new ships were constructed, others were updated. This did include the NX-01 Enterprise and the USS Endeavour, which would be under the command of Captain T'Pol. As of September 2162, the Endeavour was the last active survivor of the original NX class. All future ships would be the new Columbia class. As part of the newly appointed UESPA Chief of Staff Admiral Archer's fleet's modernization program, 8 new Columbia-class vessels were slated for construction. By July of 2165, the USS Buran and USS Shenlong were completed. The USS Apollo and USS Soyuz were expected to launch around October of that same year. The USS Ares and USS Charybdis in spring of 2166, and finally the USS Phoenix and USS Valiant by 2167. Now, just to clear up some dates and confusion, it does appear the NX Refit took place before the founding of the Federation, which is in 2161. However, the fleet modernization program took place after the Federation was founded, so therefore those ships we just mentioned came after the Federation, hence carrying the USS tag. Hopefully that clears up some dates there. It does get a little bit confusing, especially as the lore, particularly the extended lore, as in Star Trek extended canon from books, novels and video games, is a little bit iffy around there, so it's up for interpretation. Even as newer starships entered service, the Enterprise itself remained one of the most important vessels in Federation history. Its accomplishments were extraordinary. First deep space exploration missions, first contacts, the Xindi crisis, the coalition of planets, the road towards Federation unity. The NX-01 had been present for nearly all of it. The refit only strengthened that legacy. Rather than ending its career as a relic of humanity's earliest exploration efforts, the ship evolved into something capable of helping guide the next era of galactic history. And that may be why many Trekkies remain so attached to the design. The NX Refit isn't simply a new version of the Enterprise, it's Enterprise growing up. It's a vessel that carried humanity from its first uncertain steps into the stars towards the birth of the Federation itself. Now, the NX Refit story didn't end with the novels. Like many beloved Star Trek designs, it eventually found new life in Star Trek Online. Set during the 25th century, STO frequently revisits classic Starship designs and reimagines them for modern Starfleet service. The NX Refit was no exception. Players can gain access to updated versions of the design equipped with contemporary technology while preserving the iconic silhouette created by Doug Drexler and his collaborators. Now, this allows an entirely new generation of Star Trek fans to experience this vessel firsthand. For some players, the NX Refit became their first introduction to Enterprise-era starships. For longtime Enterprise fans, like myself, it represented something even more meaningful. A chance to finally command the ship that would have appeared in Season 5, if we ever got it. And in a strange way, that may be the closest many fans will ever come to seeing the NX Refit story continue on our screens. While it never officially appeared on screen in Star Trek Enterprise, we have since seen it on screen in other shows like Star Trek Picard. And its influence on Star Trek history continues to grow with every passing year. The story of the NX Refit is unique in Star Trek history because, unlike most famous starships, it wasn't created for a television episode, a movie, or even a video game. Instead, it emerged from a simple question: what would have happened next? When Enterprise first entered development in the early 2000s, production designer Herman Zimmerman, concept artist John Eves, Doug Drexler, and the rest of the creative team faced a difficult challenge. They needed to design a new Enterprise. Not just any Enterprise, but one that existed a century before Captain Kirk's famous Starship. It had to feel familiar, but also it had to feel very primitive. And perhaps most importantly, it couldn't simply be a Constitution class painted grey. The audience needed to instantly recognise it as an ancestor, not a duplicate. According to Doug Drexler, that challenge nearly produced a very different Starship. Many fans don't realise that one of the earliest concepts for Enterprise looked far closer to the Constitution class than the ship we eventually received. Earlier development work included designs featuring a secondary hull and a much more traditional Starfleet silhouette. In many ways, this already resembled the evolutionary bridge fans would later see in the NX Refit, but there was a slight problem. Someone pointed out that it looked too much like Kirk's Enterprise, and suddenly the entire direction changed. To Doug Drexler, this new concept immediately clicked. Even while designing the original NX class, he would periodically place engineering hulls beneath the model to see how the vessel might evolve. Basically, plans, designs, and ideas were already taking place regarding how Enterprise itself might evolve for the Romulan War conflict. Of course, while the Enterprise series didn't show the NX Refit, it did appear in a calendar. Doug Drexler and his collaborators spent considerable time refining every detail. The engineering hull of the NX Refit was carefully shaped to resemble the Constitution class, while still feeling less advanced. The deflector dish was inspired directly by Kirk's Enterprise. The nacelles were enclosed to better match later Federation design language. Mike Okuda contributed markings, pennants, and registry graphics to help reinforce the ship's place within the Star Trek timeline. One of the most fascinating aspects of the NX Refit is how clearly it demonstrates the evolution of Starfleet Starship design. When comparing Archer's original NX-01 to Kirk's USS Enterprise, the differences are dramatic. The Constitution class is larger, it's faster, it carries more advanced weapons, it possesses stronger defensive systems, and basically its internal volume is vastly greater. Also, the mission profile is significantly more ambitious. Yet when comparing the NX Refit to the Constitution class, those differences suddenly become much smaller. The secondary hull immediately creates a familiar silhouette. The enlarged navigational deflector resembles the system seen aboard Kirk's Enterprise. The enclosed warp nacelles begin moving towards the cleaner, more refined appearance of later Starfleet vessels. Even the internal layout starts to resemble the engineering arrangements that would eventually become standard throughout the Federation fleet. This wasn't accidental. Doug Drexler specifically designed the NX Refit to feel like a stepping stone. This wasn't the finished product, it wasn't a Constitution class prototype, but the next logical stage in the evolution of starships. In fact, one of the cleverest aspects of the design is that it intentionally remains imperfect. For example, the engineering hull is smaller than the Constitution class equivalent. The neck structure is less refined. The overall vessel still retains much of the rugged appearance of the original NX class. Essentially, it's a transitional ship, and that's precisely why it works. The NX Refit doesn't replace the Constitution class, it explains it. For years, fans wondered how Starfleet went from Archer's ship to Kirk's ship. The NX Refit gives perhaps the most convincing answer ever proposed. Now, there are very few non-canon starships that achieve the level of popularity enjoyed by the NX Refit. So why has this particular design endured? Part of the answer lies with Enterprise itself. When the series originally aired, it often struggled to find an audience. Many fans were suffering from franchise fatigue, following years of continuous Star Trek television, but over time, opinions changed. Today, Star Trek Enterprise is frequently re-evaluated as one of the franchise's most underrated series. Many viewers who revisit the show discover a strong cast, compelling stories, and some of the most important world building in Star Trek history. As Enterprise's reputation improved, interest in the unfinished future also grew. Fans wanted to know what happened next. What happened during the Earth-Romulan War? How did the Federation form? What became of Archer and his crew? And also, what happened to Enterprise? The NX Refit became symbolic of those unanswered questions. It represents the future Enterprise never got the chance to explore. It's a reminder of the stories that could have been told had the series continued. In many ways, the ship has become more than just a starship design. it's become a symbol of Star Trek Enterprise itself. It's a symbol of potential, a symbol of unfinished stories, and perhaps most importantly, a symbol of a Star Trek series that many fans now believe deserved far more time than it was actually given. When Star Trek Enterprise premiered in 2001, the series set out to tell the story of humanity's first steps into deep space. For much of its run, the show focused on exploration, first contact, and the growing pains of an inexperienced Starfleet learning to navigate a dangerous galaxy. By season 4, however, something had changed. Enterprise had found its identity. Under the guidance of executive producer Manny Coto, the series began embracing its role as a prequel. Rather than avoiding established Star Trek history, Enterprise started diving headfirst into it. The Augment Crisis, the Mirror Universe, the Vulcan Reformation, the founding of the Coalition of Planets, the Romulan drone ship conspiracy. For the first time, it truly felt like the show was building towards the future we already knew was coming. And unfortunately, that's exactly when it ended. If Star Trek Enterprise had received a 5th season, the Earth-Romulan War would almost certainly have become the central storyline. As previously mentioned, this conflict had been part of Star Trek lore since 1966's Balance of Terror episode, yet audiences had never actually seen it unfold. We knew the broad strokes. The war took place during the 2150s, and it was devastating. This reshaped the political map of the Alpha Quadrant, and it ultimately led to the creation of the Neutral Zone. But the details remain largely a mystery. Enterprise was perfectly positioned to tell that story if it got the chance. I mean, Season 4 had already established that the Romulans were a major threat operating through deception, manipulation, and proxy forces. Their drone ship program demonstrated how dangerous they could be even without revealing themselves openly. Everything was pointed towards an eventual war. And when that war did eventually come, the NX-1 would have needed to evolve with it, and this is where the NX Refit makes so much sense. The original NX class was an explorer. The NX Refit was a vessel built for a galaxy at war. Now, one of the most fascinating things about the NX Refit is that it potentially represents the final major chapter of Archer's Enterprise. Think about it. The NX-1 launched humanity into the stars. It even survived being wound up in the temporal Cold War. It saved Earth from the Xindi crisis, and it then helped unite Vulcans, Andorians, and Tellarites. And then, had the series continued, it likely would have carried humanity through the Romulan War itself. The Refit wasn't simply an upgrade, it was a culmination of everything Enterprise had learned throughout this journey. Every damaged hull plate, every tactical lesson, every engineering breakthrough. All of it led to a more capable vessel ready to face the greatest challenge of its own career. Just because we're talking about it, perhaps the most famous cancel plan for Star Trek Enterprise involved one character in particular. This was Commander Shran, played brilliantly by Jeffrey Combs. Shran quickly became one of Enterprise's most beloved recurring characters. Over 4 seasons, he evolved from a suspicious Andorian military officer into one of Archer's closest allies. According to numerous discussions from those involved with the series, there were plans to bring Shran aboard Enterprise as a regular cast member during a future season. Imagine that for a moment. Archer, T'Pol, and Shran. Fighting side by side during the Romulan War, solving crises together. It's one of those ideas that feels so perfect, it's difficult not to wonder what might have been. And if the NX Refit had appeared on our screen, Shran would have likely been standing on its bridge. Another major focus of the cancelled future seasons would have been the transition from the Coalition of Planets to the United Federation of Planets. This is arguably one of the most important events in all of Star Trek history, if not the most important. I mean, without it, there is no Federation. No Starfleet as we know it, no future USS Enterprise, no Kirk, no Picard, no Federation ideals spreading throughout the galaxy. Enterprise, as a series, was uniquely positioned to tell that story because its characters were directly responsible for making it happen. Such as Archer's diplomacy, T'Pol's guidance. The relationships built throughout the 4 seasons, everything was leading towards that moment. The NX Refit would have served as a flagship of that transition. Not merely a united Earth vessel, but one of the first true Federation starships. A symbol of multiple worlds working together towards a common future. One of the big aspects often overlooked in discussions of the NX Refit is what it would have meant for Jonathan Archer himself. By the time of the Federation's founding, Archer had become far more than a starship captain. At this point, he was a statesman, a diplomat, a military leader, and eventually one of the most important figures in Federation history. Future generations would remember him alongside names like Kirk, Picard, and Janeway. The NX Refit would have represented one of the final stages of that journey. The Starship class that began as humanity's first Warp 5 explorer would have become the vessel that helped usher in the Federation era. It's a fitting parallel, both the captain and the Starship grown beyond what they were originally designed to be. Now, over 20 years after Star Trek Enterprise ended, fans are still discussing what Season 5 might have looked like. That alone tells you something. Most cancelled television shows simply fade away. Enterprise didn't. The question remains because the story is still unfinished. We know where Star Trek history does go next. We know the Romulan War happened, and of course, we know the Federation was founded. We know Archer becomes one of Starfleet's greatest heroes, even president of the Federation. But we never got to see the journey. Maybe one day we'll see Star Trek United. The NX Refit has become a symbol of that lost future, a visual representation of the stories left untold. And perhaps that's the real reason the design has endured for so long. It isn't simply a starship. It is a glimpse into an alternate timeline where Enterprise received the ending it truly deserved. A future where Archer's crew completed their mission. A future where the NX-01 evolved into the vessel it was always meant to become. Effectively, the Enterprise that never was. And perhaps the Enterprise that should have been. Do you agree that Star Trek Enterprise should have got 7 seasons? And would you have wanted to see the NX Refit on our screens? That's our history of the NX Refit in the Star Trek universe. Sadly, this is the Enterprise that never was. But would you have wanted to see more of it? If you're interested in videos like the Earth-Romulan War, or perhaps every NX class starship known to exist, you can check those out on the end screen now, here on the Trek Central channel. Now, as mentioned, you can support the development of Trek Central's videos. Please join our Patreon via the link below. You'll get exclusive access to videos and events, as well as more Galaxy class rewards. If you want to keep up to date on the latest Star Trek news, lore, and more, then make sure to hit that subscribe button to never miss a video from the team here at Trek Central. You can also follow us on social media or our community Discord server. For now, I've been Captain Jack, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Live long and prosper, my friends. Goodbye.